Hey guys, as most of you probably know by now, Origin PC has been a proud sponsor of the show for a while, and I wanted to take some time to call them out and show off a computer that they sent me. Now this computer is part of their Millennium Desktop series and sports one of their newer cases, the Corsair 5000X. Inside this bad boy we have a 16-core AMD Ryzen 5950X processor, which has 32 threads and boots clock speeds up to 4.9 GHz with 72 megabytes of cache. Along with that, we've got the AMD Radeon 6800 XT graphics card, which will allow you to play games at super high frame rates and enable 4K gameplay. Being that we're using these two AMD products in the computer can take advantage of the shared PCIe 4.0 capability and AMD Smart Access Memory, which optimizes the computer's performance. When it comes to performance, Origin PC allows you to customize the build of your computer so you can pick and choose the hardware that goes in based on your computing needs. Once you order your computer, you can feel safe knowing that Origin PC offers world-class tech support that is available 24/7 via phone or online. So if you want to check out the offerings that Origin PC has for you guys, click the link in the box down below. And once again, a big thank you to Origin PC for sponsoring today's video and beyond. Thanks for watching. Back to the show. Ubisoft, one of the absolute biggest publishers and developers in the world, has caught a lot of flack over the years. Let's be honest, in our current gaming climate, tons of companies that we buy our games from are having lots of internal problems and discussions that we're hearing more and more about each and every day. So while we hear more and more about the awful workplace problems of all those developers and publishing partner studios all over the world, it got me thinking about franchises with yearly entries. So many people coming together under high octane pressure to release a brand new entry in a game that just came out the year before. One of the biggest commercial issues I feel that game studios have, and Ubisoft is one of the biggest perpetrators of this, is unleashing new entries and series within yearly to bi-yearly installments. And just look at how many people work on a Ubisoft game. Thousands upon thousands of people across several studios. If you take Assassin's Creed, look at its successes, and then look at Far Cry, you may see a bit of a pattern here. The truth of the matter is that Ubisoft basically defined a certain type of open world game. And that got me thinking about the perfect example for today's discussion, Far Cry 4. For players who love clearing outposts with a big variety of weapons, finding dozens of collectibles, and cruising through an action-packed story with some great voice acting, there is nothing that compares to the last few entries in the Far Cry series. Far Cry 3, which is a fan favorite to many, has solidified the Ubisoft model, and Far Cry 4 is the next logical step in this franchise. It's a bigger game with more stuff to do and a few more refinements here and there. But Far Cry 4 also suffers from a lot of the same issues that plagued Far Cry 3, especially for those of us compelled to complete them. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another brand new episode of The Completionist, where we don't just beat the games, we complete them. There's a certain type of game that is always popular, always satisfying, and always way too long. I'm referring to the games that follow the Ubisoft model, which everyone and their mother has an opinion on. Far Cry 4 builds and expands on the foundation that Far Cry 3 made, but does that automatically make it worth completing? I mean, I am going to reach some high mountaintops and tumble into some low valleys, because completing Far Cry 4 really made me consider what makes this kind of game, with its huge map, endless checklists, collectibles for no reason, yet incredibly fun base gameplay, worth completing. There is so much to love about Far Cry 4. Like delicious crab Rangoon, it's a decadent feast that is hard to put down once you start. Yeah, I could always say, it's great, but here's where I wish you did better. But I think Far Cry 4 stands tall as a wonderful example of a franchise that has changed over time.
Yes! All glory goes to the winner!
Now, Far Cry has come a long way. It's a series that has reinvented itself at least 3 separate times and continues to do so, however incrementally. Far Cry 4 sits squarely in the middle of the franchise's evolution. The very first Far Cry game is a sci-fi shooter, the kind that dominated the early and mid-2000s. I've never played it, and I probably won't. 4 years after that release, in 2008, came the gritty Far Cry 2. It has its defenders, but again, I never played it. Because what brought me into the franchise was Far Cry 3, the first game in the franchise that would grow to become a genre-defining hit. Far Cry 3 was like an addictive drug that won me and millions of other people all over the world in 2012. And just 2 years after Far Cry 3 dominated the scene, and 1 year after the release of Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, came Far Cry 4. Now, I feel like this game was a little overshadowed by 3, and at first, it's easy to see why. Superficially speaking, this game looks and plays extremely similar to 3. Now, it's still a first-person shooter with stealth elements and light crafting, with a huge map to explore, with a variety of fun vehicles to drive. And Far Cry 4 was also released just a year after the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One came into the scene, so it has the dubious honor of being a cross-generation game. But honestly, for a game that is at least 7 years old, it looks absolutely incredible. And not only because at the time of release, Ubisoft had clearly mastered the Dunia engine, stylistically speaking, Far Cry 4 is leaps and bounds ahead of 3, at least for the non-completionist. To me, the arc of the series has been this. 1, make a semi-straightforward sci-fi shooter. The second game, mix things up with aggressively hostile systems that the player has to overcome. The third game, it's checklist time. 3 still builds off the previous entries, but also has way more collectibles, side quests, skills, progression through skills, and story to plow through. And part of what makes Far Cry 4 great is that even though the game boils down to completing hundreds of the same types of interactions over and over again, the setting, tone, and aesthetics make everything satisfying to do. Far Cry 4 takes place in the fictional country of Kyrat, based on a region of northern India near the Himalayas. This region is full of snow-capped mountains and lush jungles, and is unfortunately in the middle of deadly civil unrest, propagated by the sharp-dressed and even sharper-tongued Pagan Min. Our player character, Ajay Ghale, who grew up in the USA, has returned to the land of his parents to spread his deceased mother's ashes, as per her final request. But on the way to do so, his bus was waylaid by Min's forces. In short order, Ajay is caught up in a perilous civil war where he must pick sides to help shape the future of Kyrat. Now, I found the story strong. Ajay is an instantly more compelling protagonist than Jason Brody of Far Cry 3, the biggest bro the world has ever seen. Ajay actually has a personal connection to Kyrat, and reason to care about its future. It turns out that Ajay is the prodigal son of the region. Ajay's mother spirited him away to America when he was a child, and returning to Kyrat is a meaningful moment. His father was the founder of the Golden Path, a group of rebels who want to wrest control of Kyrat away from a set of corrupt leaders. The plot kept throwing curveballs at me, and it was easy to get swept away along in the excitement. Far Cry 3 flirted with the concept of a civil war, but was mostly focused on Jason Brody's rescue mission and revenge antics. Far Cry 4 is concerned with revolution and even recovery. It's an interesting swerve for the series, and one that continues to have a lasting impact on the future of Far Cry development. Far Cry 4's director, Alex Hutchinson, also directed Assassin's Creed 3, which takes place during the Revolutionary War of American history. Clearly, Hutchinson is interested in the idea of what it takes to build and lead a country. Is violence a core part of nation building? Can a charismatic yet bloodthirsty villain be compelling enough to keep players hooked until the very end? Should streamers pay licensing fees to publishers in order to stream games? Alright, that last one may have gotten Mr. Hutchinson in a ton of trouble a few years ago, and I'm not going to dunk on him anymore going forward. His legacy at Ubisoft is cemented, and though both Assassin's Creed 3 and Far Cry 4 have their detractors, I think it's great to have completed 2 separate games by the same creative director and get a sense of what's going on in this guy's head. Ubisoft is meticulous about the construction of its open worlds. The Assassin's Creed series shows that the company will go to great lengths to achieve visual fidelity, but Far Cry 4 is less concerned about making Kyrat feel realistic. There is a punk rock sensibility that colors everything around the player. Rather than getting people hyped about recreating a real place, Far Cry 4 lets players experience the world from an outsider's eyes. From the second that Pagan Min's helicopter roars into the scene, I was reminded of Apocalypse Now. Only instead of Flight of the Valkyries, it was the Clash pouring out of the speakers, and I was hooked. Ubisoft found a formula that worked in Far Cry 3, and Far Cry 4 keeps things rolling with a similarly unhinged charismatic villain who torments the player from the jump. To be clear, Troy Baker's Pagan Min is no Voss from Far Cry 3. Voss was the embodiment of pure menace, played to perfection by Michael Mando. But Troy Baker is a living legend, and Pagan Min is damn entertaining. There are shades of the Joker here, which makes sense when you remember that Baker voiced the Joker in Arkham Origins. The character certainly doesn't have any lines as memorable as when Voss defines insanity, but he has his moments. Troy Baker is chewing the scenery in the best way possible, and the character's flamboyant excess and barely concealed range make him extremely compelling. I loved any time Pagan Min was around to torment me, and his taunting radio calls stand out as some of the best parts of Far Cry 4. Pagan Min is even directly part of the game's secret ending, which can be seen immediately after starting the game. After the tense opening minutes, Pagan Min sits the player character down at a table and tells us not to move, that he'll be right back right away to take us where we want to go. I didn't touch the controller for about 15 minutes, and lo and behold, Pagan Min came back just like he promised. We hopped onto his helicopter and flew directly into the final location of the game. What would normally be a hard-earned and emotional moment was instead handed directly to me in a delightful subversion of expectations. After performing my mother's final wish, Pagan Min and I were free to f it up as we pleased. But there is plenty of other stuff to love about Far Cry 4. Systems that were introduced in earlier Far Cry games are even more refined here. I still had the weapon wheel where I could holster a mix of sidearms, long guns, throwing knives, grenades, and healing syringes. There were still plenty of enemy outposts that I could clear with a mix of stealthy stabbing and explosive ordnance. I could even lure hungry predators into hostile territory by hucking big shreds of meat towards enemies and watching them get ripped apart by snow leopards or bears. The setting is incredible, and the contrast of gorgeous traditional temples next to beat-up shades and jeeps helps give a sense of what Ajay is fighting for. By conversing with and engaging in side quests with the awesome side characters Sabal and Amita, I was able to influence the direction of the Golden Path. Now, you know I love a good story, and there were times when I felt like my actions had real, discernible impact on my surroundings. But most importantly, Far Cry 4 nails what feels good about completing a game like this. Ubisoft games, especially newer ones, tend to be fucking massive. Not only do I have to contend with a main plot, which often requires multiple playthroughs, there are trophies and even in-game completion percentages impacted by collectibles and side quests. But with Far Cry 4, the trophies aren't overly complicated. There are a lot of them, even more so since I also completed the Yeti-themed DLC, but they didn't feel draining to complete. Most I was able to earn without a ton of effort and could just hang on for the ride. And because I recently completed Far Cry 3 about a year ago, and this game plays so similar to that one, I started playing Far Cry 4 on the hardest difficulty. And even at its most punishing, I never felt like this game was unfair. In the early portions of my adventure, I felt like I was being pushed to my limit, which is a genuinely cool feeling. Since capturing outposts is one of the main aspects of completion, I always spent a little time plotting out how I would approach each outpost. On a harder difficulty, I had to improvise and work with my surroundings to achieve the results that I wanted. That's the other thing that's great about this game. It is often unpredictable, and that's reflective especially in the Valley of the Yetis DLC. The Valley of the Yetis was not all what I expected to be. Part horror story, part creepy mystery. I never would have thought the game would diverge from the pretty self-serious and contained plot of the base game into something this wild. There are several side quests in the main campaign that allude to mysticism and have magical elements, but nothing as blatant or downright creepy as the Yeti stuff. To be clear, I thought it was awesome. A great DLC with some really solid gimmicks, didn't overstay its welcome, and brought a lot more weirdness and distinction into the game. It feels like with Far Cry 4, the developers found a nice balance. They found the thing that works, but didn't completely milk it dry. Colorful villain? Check. Compelling mechanics? Check. A world that I wanted to actually spend time in, even as it constantly tried to kill me? Check plus. Far Cry 4 finds the sweet spot of open-world action games in a way that I was wonderfully surprised by. Sometimes it just feels good to play one of these, which is a nice feeling. So here's the thing. Far Cry 4, totally rules. From the moment I started playing it, I was ready to absolute tear it the hell up. But if I left it at that, I'd only be telling you half the story. I'd be leaving out what the actual hardcore players experienced. Yes, this game is absolutely polished as fuck, but completing everything? Totally brutal. So much so that I almost felt like the fun was being sucked out by the end of my experience. No amount of Yetis can save a game from the repetitive BS with no light at the end of that tunnel. There is plenty to love about Far Cry 4. Luring a snow leopard into a camp to eat another enemy's face off gives you a rush like no other. But after you've done that 500 times, it loses its luster. For a game as polished and promising as this one, I was struck by how much padding is stuffed into it. This was an experience that I absolutely loved in short bursts, but when you're playing to completion, eventually you are going to hit a wall. And with Far Cry 4, I hit that wall very hard. There's a line in Shakespeare about brevity being the soul of wit. And I know sometimes I blather on a little too long in some of my videos when I could be more succinct. But Far Cry 4 takes the idea of brevity to the top of Mount Everest and shoots it point blank in the forehead. There is simply too much of everything in this game. From side quests to main missions, weapons to collectibles, arena fights to magical realism acid trips. Far Cry 4 could use a real hard-ass editor. From a design perspective, I respect the play. Ubisoft is at the top of their game here, and with this more is more approach to the open world, they've all but ensured that players will want to explore the entire map, even if the rewards aren't satisfying at all. The satisfaction is in going down the checklist, and as a checklist game, Far Cry 4 is a masterclass. But when the momentum slowed down and I stopped to think about what I was doing and why, I couldn't help but experience frustration. So much of the joy of Far Cry 4 is found in how you approach situations, not necessarily the situations themselves, because they're pretty similar after a point. There's a real novelty, especially in the early to mid game, in experimenting with the most efficient and fun ways to take down enemy camps. But after, I don't know, 14, maybe 15 outposts, I felt like things were flattening out. And lo and behold, I still had a ton more to go. It's the same with collectibles. There are hundreds of collectibles to find or destroy. Some of them are tied to trophies, like the Rewriting History trophy, which required me to remove 30 propaganda posters. Not a large amount, but something that I achieved just partway through. But in reality, there are actually something like 150 posters to find, which is so many more than it needed to be. Completion of this game turned into earning the Platinum Trophy, plus a ton of other BS. Pretty much every collectible has this issue, where there are way more of the thing around than I actually needed to get a reward for. Since I also had to keep in mind in-game completion percentage, that meant I couldn't just be satisfied with just getting the trophies. I went out of my way to tick every last box, and it started to feel grindy, repetitive, and very unsatisfying. The map is genuinely beautiful and well designed, but there simply isn't much of a reason to go off the beaten path here. Collectibles didn't really require me to go out of my way, so I found myself wondering, why bother a lot of the time? It's not like I absolutely needed to be rewarded for seeing it all, but some small reason to go out of the way would have really helped my enjoyment here. It's paradoxical, because most of my time playing Far Cry 4 went down really smoothly. It always feels amazing to fill out the skill tree and unlock new murder skills, and taking out an outpost using only a silenced sniper rifle from a mountain away is incredibly satisfying. But like a delicious meal by an overambitious chef, I was stuffed just after a few courses in. No matter how delicious this dessert may be, I can't help but feel sickened by the thought of more food after dozens of plates. One part of completion actively made me detest one aspect of the game. There's a combat arena in Far Cry 4. And though I liked the concept, Far Cry as a whole is not a series known for its amazingly tight gunplay. This is not Doom or Halo or nowhere near Call of Duty. Shining a spotlight on the combat is an interesting choice, but it doesn't pay off. The combat isn't overtly difficult or complicated, so engaging in these arena fights was really just only time consuming. Looking back, it seems like the arena was just a way for Ubisoft to push their own Arena Master app, which is no longer supported to this day. So I had to grind challenges the old-fashioned way, and reaching rank 15 took a lot of trial and error. mirror. Not particularly tough, but they eventually became annoying, which maybe soured my feelings on some of the rest of the game. And as a reminder, the reason why I'm complaining so much, or whining as some of you may think, is because completing the game is one thing versus just experiencing it. And as much as I loved to hate Pagan Min, the character becomes kind of a non-entity partway through the game, and that's depressing. For a game that has too much of everything else, I wanted more of this particular character. Far Cry 3 notoriously had this same villain problem, and although 4 corrects this to a degree somewhat, I still think you don't get enough Min in this game, which is a shame because Ajay actually has a personal connection to this villain. But then during the actual story, we were kept apart for way longer than I'd expected. I felt that way about a few of the other side characters too, that they were interesting, but ultimately we didn't spend as much time together as I'd hoped. Like Sabal is super cool. He's a great character and is even voiced by Naveen Andrews, aka Syed from Lost. But I would have loved a few more moments to get to know the guy, especially in the beginning of the game. Ajay goes from zero to sniping dudes off snowmobiles extremely quickly, and I think a little more connection to Sabal and what he stands for at the start would have helped ground Ajay that much more. The story for me suffers when framed in terms of completion. Yes, it's partly a product of its era, where it was and still is easy to criticize open world games for suffocating any sense of urgency in the face of side quests and collectibles. But it feels particularly egregious here. There is real human suffering, atrocities happening in this war-torn region, and yet Ajay, whose father literally founded the movement that is fighting for freedom from a sadistic tyrant, can just off whenever he pleases to hunt some rare animals. It feels incongruous. This may not be a new criticism, but I found myself thinking about what made Far Cry 3 a slog to complete and applying those same thoughts to Far Cry 4. In truth, it's probably possible to beat this entire game in less than 20 hours, but I found that doing every little thing dragged the experience out longer and longer. For the most part, I really was on board, but eventually I hit my breaking point, because boy howdy is this game really another one of those, and I have completed a ton of those. Those in-game completion percentages have really started to affect me here. And of course, there's the elephant in the room. How can this game be both creatively satisfying and a huge hit for the publisher? This is the 4th main entry in this series and is undoubtedly fine-tuned. Yet Far Cry 4 suffers from having to serve two masters. The business side of game development demands that this game be bigger and more action-packed than ever before, even if the creative director or level designer or whoever wanted to make a more focused game that deep dives into revolutionary struggle. This push and pull trickles down and affects not just the player, but the programmers and the developers too. Now, to be clear, I do not claim to be an expert here, especially about workplace practices and business decisions. I'm only speaking from the experience of completing the game. All I know is that when big multinational publishers like Ubisoft demand a big hit, just 2 years after a previous hit, people's personal lives will suffer. Developers experience crunch and harmful studio practices can get overlooked. And not to equate the experience of completing the finished product with working on it, but I can certainly feel the effects of some executives saying, well, this worked before, let's put the same stuff in the sequel. And that doesn't always mean an enjoyable completion experience. Now, this might come across as nitpicking, but there is a reason I don't just wrap everything up in a nice little bow and say, complete it. The truth is, there's a lot that I loved and a lot that frankly bored the shit out of me as I journey towards my completion path. I found myself walking the middle path most of the time, because every time I felt numb having to repeat yet another combat encounter, I'd find a great piece of flavor text or execute an extremely satisfying kill, or I would marvel at the subtle storytelling, only to remember that the entire game starts off with the stranger essentially telling Ajay to murder everyone on his way to the first checkpoint. It's Far Cry 4, and like a monkey in a tree, it loves to swing from extreme to extreme. As much as I get fired up if a game doesn't hit the story beats I expect, or falls apart due to baffling design decisions, I have to admit that Far Cry 4 is somewhat inoculated against criticism. At the end of the day, Far Cry 4 isn't a realistic, gritty look at what happens when a revolution tears down systems of power and erects new ones. Nor is it solely a goofy shooter where the player mows down thousands of enemies for points. Instead, it's somewhere in the middle, riding the line between tasteful commentary on your duty to family and community, and going in guns a-blazing to save an outpost outpost that you just liberated. For every outpost I liberated, there eventually came a moment where the outpost would come under attack again. When that happened, I would rush over to defend it, but I realized the absurdity of the situation after liberating an outpost. Turning to leave, and seconds after hearing someone shouting, "We're under attack!" I'd laugh and keep on going. And as much as I grew frustrated with the arena challenges, there is one reward that is pretty spectacular. Pretty much every reward in this game exists to transform Ajay into a more efficient killer, and the arena is no exception. After hitting rank 10, I unlocked the Bushman, a powerful assault rifle. Might not be the best weapon in the game, but it is a worthy reward. I just wish there was something else substantial unlocked after hitting the final rank. That's honestly the main complaint for me. There are some pretty great side quests in Far Cry 4, really inventive stuff that meets and even exceeds what I experienced in Far Cry 3. I mean, I went to Shangri-La over the course of a few missions. It was a trip. A spectral tiger defeated my enemies, and I rode a giant elephant to fight demons. But this whole experience felt sort of segmented off from the rest of the game. And though I did earn some extremely useful rewards for completing those missions, like the Huntsman skill, which gave me greater bow control, I couldn't help but feel like I wanted something more here. I think it's great when Far Cry dips into the surreal and the supernatural. I cannot wait to see the Shangri-La equivalent in Far Cry 5 when I finally get around to playing that. I think it's bold that this game tries to have it both ways, with the grounded Revolution story side by side with battling demons. I just kind of wish it all fit a little more cleanly together. The more I played Far Cry 4, the more standout moments like Shangri-La or the Trippy Yogi Brothers side quests faded into the background. Environments started to feel like one long green blur. For a fictional landscape, I really felt like the variety was lacking. Every satisfying gameplay mechanic or cool story beat was stretched out just a little too long for my liking. I spent about 45 hours completing everything, liberating 24 outposts along the way. I found hundreds of collectibles, from those 150 propaganda posters, to 55 masks, to 20 letters from Ajay's father. I appreciated that these collectibles gave me a reason to scour Kyrat, but there is no real reward for 100% in-game completion. I do feel like the experience was somewhat diminished as a result. Getting all 58 trophies, including the 7 DLC trophies in Far Cry 4, is an achievable goal for sure. It's a challenge, but nothing overly strenuous. It's the in-game completion that starts to feel like a drag after time. Not to be reductive, but a classic case of Ubisoft game being lots of fun and exciting in the moment, but doing every little task thins out that excitement until drudgery sets in. I'm basically predisposed to love any modern Far Cry game at this point, at least in the short term. This era of Far Cry is probably the most fun to play and complete, though I know for a fact that they only expand bigger and bigger in the next few entries. Far Cry 4 starts off real strong, and though I can list a string of negatives off the top of my head, at the end of the day, it's still an incredibly enjoyable experience. It's also an overly long one that is filled with unnecessary padding and is, to me, a little in the shadow of its previous entry. If you're a fan of these kinds of games, or just haven't played an open world shooter in a bit and want to see how one from 7 years ago holds up, Far Cry 4 might be your jam. So, with that in mind, guys, I give this game my completionist rating of finish it.
Finish it!